Welcome to Past People. To support our channel, please subscribe. The life of Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale. He was known as Eddie within his family and was the eldest child of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Despite being second in line to the British throne from birth, he never became King or Prince of Wales due to his untimely death. Eddie had a diverse early life, travelling the world as a Royal Navy cadet and later joining the British Army, though he didn't actively serve. He had 2 unsuccessful courtships before becoming engaged to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck in late 1891, only to tragically succumb to illness during a major pandemic shortly thereafter. His life has been shrouded in mystery, with speculations about his intellect, sexuality, and mental health. Some unfounded rumours linked him to scandals like the Cleveland Street affair, and even suggested that he might be Jack the Ripper. However, many records disprove these claims. Born prematurely in 1864, Albert Victor was the first child of Prince of Wales and his wife, named after his grandparents, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. Despite his formal title, he was affectionately called Eddie by his family. Albert Victor's early education was alongside his younger brother, Prince George, under the tutelage of John Neil Dalton, starting in 1871. Dalton's rigorous program covered academics, physical activities, and military drills, but Albert Victor's intellectual progress was deemed slow, attributed to an uninspiring teaching. Despite learning Danish and overcoming language barriers, his academic performance remained sluggish. Speculations about the impact of his mother's deafness or physical factors were considered. In 1877, both brothers joined HMS Britannia for naval training, but Albert Victor fell behind due to illness. In 1879, they began a 3-year naval cadet tour on HMS Bacchante, travelling extensively across the British Empire, including stops in the America, the Falkland Islands, and more, even receiving tattoos in Japan. Afterwards, in 1883, Albert Victor and Prince George pursued separate paths. Albert Victor attended Trinity College, Cambridge, where his academic interests waned. He engaged in a social life and made connections with notable figures, but it's unclear if he had any sexual experiences during this time. In 1885, he joined the 10th Hussars, serving in various roles, and despite disliking drilling activities, he enjoyed polo. His academic challenges didn't hinder his promotions, and eventually he became a captain. During this period, his private life was uneventful, despite fellow officers' efforts to introduce him to the world, which he resisted. The Cleveland Scandal. In July 1889, a male brothel in Cleveland Street, London, was uncovered by the Met Police, revealing clients' names, including Lord Arthur Somerset, an ex-equerry to the Prince of Wales. And at the time, all homosexual acts between men were illegal, carrying potential consequences like social exile and up to 2 years hard labour in prison. The scandal implicated high-ranking individuals, sparking rumours that Prince Albert Victor was involved. Though the prostitutes didn't directly implicate him, it's believed Somerset's solicitor, Arthur Newton, may have spread these rumours to divert attention. Reports emerged in December 1889 that the Prince and Princess of Wales received anonymous letters related to the scandal. The Prince of Wales intervened and no clients were prosecuted. Concrete evidence against Albert Victor never emerged. Some speculate about his involvement, but historians found no evidence supporting claims of homosexuality or bisexuality. While English newspapers avoided linking the prince directly to the scandal, international press coverage, particularly in Welsh, colonial and American newspapers, was less restrained. Lord Waterford, Somerset's sister, and Somerset himself denied Albert Victor's involvement, but rumours still persisted. But no one involved in the original case was convicted of perjury or struck off during the Cleveland Street scandal. His Indian tour. In October 1889, Albert Victor embarked on a 7-month tour of British India. a pre-planned journey unrelated to the London scandal rumours. He visited various destinations like Athens, Port Said, Cairo and Aden, arriving in Bombay on the 9th of November 1889. His trip included generous hospitality from many parts of the world. He mostly used trains for travel, occasionally riding ceremonial elephants and engaging in sport hunting. During the trip, he met Mrs. Margery Haddon, who later claimed he was the father of her son, Clarence Haddon. However, her allegations lacked evidence and were dismissed. In the 1920s, Clarence revived the story, but was discredited during his 1934 extortion trial, when documents showed his birth date predated Albert Victor's encounter with Mrs. Haddon by at least 2 years. Albert Victor was granted the titles Duke of Clarence and Avondale and Earl of Athlone of Queen Victoria's 71st birthday, May 24, 1890, but these honours didn't affect the royal line of succession, even if Clarence Haddon's claims were true. Potential brides. In 1889, Queen Victoria, Albert Victor's grandmother, hoped that he would marry his paternal cousin, Princess Alex of Hessen by Rhine, who was among her beloved grandchildren. While at Balmoral Castle, he proposed to Alex, but she didn't share his affections and declined his engagement offer. Albert Victor persisted in his efforts to persuade Alex, but eventually gave up in 1890 when she wrote him a letter expressing her inability to marry him, citing her affection for him as a cousin. After the unsuccessful proposal to Alex, Queen Victoria suggested that Albert Victor consider marrying another first cousin, Princess Margaret of Prussia. She conveyed her thoughts on Margaret's suitability for the role of queen in a formal letter to him. However, Albert Victor's mother strongly objected to the idea, and it was ultimately abandoned. During this period, Albert Victor fell in love with Princess Helene of Orleans, but her Roman Catholic faith posed an initial obstacle. Despite Queen Victoria's initial opposition, she eventually supported their marriage plans when they offered concessions. However, Helene's father remained resolute in his refusal, leading to the courtship's end. Albert Victor's affections then turned to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, the daughter of Queen Victoria's first cousin, Princess Mary Adelaide, Duchess of Teck. Queen Victoria fully supported this match, finding Mary charming, sensible and attractive. On the 3rd of December 1891, Albert Victor proposed to Mary at Luton Hoo, the Danish ambassador's country residence. Their wedding was scheduled for the 27th of February 1892. In 1891, Albert Victor wrote to Lady Sybil, expressing his love, though he didn't reveal the object of his affection. A week later, he inquired if she had any affection for him, hoping for even a small measure of love. In late 1891, he was linked to Lydia Miller, a former Gaiety Theatre chorus girl, who tragically took her life with carbolic acid. It was suggested that Albert Victor, using Lord Charles Montagu as a front, had urged her to quit the stage. The scandal, akin to the Cleveland Street affair, received overseas press coverage. British regional newspapers quoted the Star, confirming the connection between Albert Victor and Lydia. Rumours later emerged in 1900 posthumously regarding his involvement with another former Gaiety girl, Maud Richardson, with allegations of attempted royal family payoffs. Letters were found later on from Albert Victor mentioning a £200 payment towards the family. Around mid-1890, Albert Victor was treated by multiple doctors, referred to as having fever or gout in correspondence. Some speculate he may have had a mild venereal disease like gonorrhea, potentially recurring from an earlier episode, though the exact ailment remains uncertain. In 1892, at the age of 28, Albert Victor fell ill during a pandemic and died from pneumonia. His death deeply affected his family, particularly his mother, Princess Alexandra, his younger brother, Prince George, who later married Princess Mary of Teck, his fiancée, and became King George V in 1910. Albert Victor's tomb, designed by Alfred Gilbert, is a remarkable sculpture in the Albert Memorial Chapel near St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. His legacy remains marked by fascination and intrigue, as his life continues to be a subject of historical interest and debate. Royal facts about George V. The Victorian family of Queen Victoria was full of scandal and drama, and as the son of Edward VII, George was not void of this family drama himself. George was put forward into the front and centre of this drama, as well as having a tragic relationship with his controversial elder son, and that meant that George barely had a moment of peace in his life. George was born into his role of the spare heir on the 3rd of June 1865. His place of birth was Marlborough House, right in the heart of London. His mother was Princess Alexandra of Denmark, and his father was Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII. He was part of a large brood of children of 6, and despite his father being away on various rendezvous with many mistresses and women of the night, he lived in a privileged, large and luxurious mansion with his prince and princess siblings, and his parents were far from ordinary, and their arranged marriage was far from a fairy tale. George was the grandson of one of the most powerful people in the world, Queen Victoria. His grandmother's relationship with his father was strained, and she did not trust him with the royal duties 1 ounce. This meant that Edward had a lot of time on his hands and had to occupy himself somehow, and his hobbies were very controversial. Not only was he a disappointment to her, but she also blamed him for the untimely death of her husband, meaning she could barely even look at him. She took away all of his royal responsibilities and refused to allow him any involvement in the royal court at all. Although his father was able to have 6 children with his wife, for the majority of their marriage he was away, getting his end away. Despite his father's controversial behaviour and adultery towards his mother, George grew up in awe of his father, and he was mostly liked by the general public. Perhaps he was in awe of his father because he was blissfully unaware of his parents' double life. The childhood George was aware of was that of a happy royal family, but it would only become clearer as he grew older that his father was often absent for long periods of time. It is likely that he believed that his father was on official royal duties, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Prince Albert Edward eventually succeeded his mother and became King Edward VII, but before that he had another name, Dirty Bertie. His father was becoming a womanizer, and his wife had to accept that he would never be monogamous. She knew that he was sleeping around with mistresses, but she had to ignore it if she wished to be his queen consort and wife. It is believed that he had at least 55 mistresses, and those are just the ones that are known about. It was due to this behaviour that got him the nickname Dirty Bertie, which is not the best name to be associated with the future King of England. Bertie was unfazed by the nickname, and he continued to womanize his way through society with his 55 mistresses, as well as the prostitutes that he saw in the Parisian brothels. Yet for all his debauchery, Edward was remarkably discreet, and more often than not, the society gossip could only guess at who was sharing the prince's bed on a given night. Prince George was not originally destined to be the King of the UK, but tragically the death of his eldest brother, Prince Albert Victor, meant the crown fell at his feet. George was a second-born son, and there was only a year between the boys. They were educated alongside each other, with neither one gaining the title of a star student. Their father was also a young boy who did not get on with the royal education system, and so when it was evident that his sons were not interested either, he shipped them away from home in a bid to make real men of them. The Prince of Wales believed that the best way to become a royal man was to join the Royal Navy, and George's father sent both him and his brother off for training when he was just 12 years old, and 3 years later, at the age of 15, the pair of them entered service on HMS Bacchante. His life on the ship did not involve active combat and instead could resemble a holiday travelling the world than a strict boot camp for boys. Aboard the ship, George and his brother travelled the world together. They were privileged to visit the furthest reaches of the British Empire, from the Caribbean to South Africa to Australia. In 1881, they visited Japan, where the teenage George made a scandalous decision to get a tattoo of a blue and red dragon on his arm. George and his brother had endured many interesting events together, but as Albert Victor was to be king, his life was to take a different turn to George's. His brother was enrolled to Trinity College to study while he remained in the Navy. He was now a lonesome man without his brother as his sidekick, but a new love would enter his life instead when he met the woman of his dreams. George began serving with his uncle Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh in Malta. He was the best placed to show him the reins of being the spare heir to the throne, as his uncle was also the second-born son. During this trip, his uncle had brought his daughter, Princess Mary of Edinburgh, with him, and Marie was George's first cousin, but this didn't stop him from falling in love with her. Strangely enough, the love match was approved by the royal family, with his grandmother, father and uncle all approving. For the royal family, it seems like a match made in heaven. At least, it did for most of them. Others weren't so happy about it, and that's when the scheming began. Join me in part 2 to delve into how George's love life took an even stranger turn, from falling in love with his first cousin to marrying his dead brother's fiancée. The cousins were getting on brilliantly, but not everybody was a fan of the love match, and some even despised the idea. George's mother and her sister were some of the people against the love match between the first cousins, not that it was because of this. They were just worried about the political problems the match would cause, and marriages were often a way to improve friendships between countries and political parties. It was George's aunt that put an end to the love match. She managed to persuade Princess Marie to turn down George's hand of marriage. She would not become the Queen of the United Kingdom, but she did go on to become the Queen of Romania. George was devastated, but his life was only going to take a further turn for the worst when he fell poorly. George had contracted typhoid. This was a scary concept for the prince's family, as it was rumoured to be the same disease that stole the life of his grandfather, Prince Albert. He was completely out of action for 6 weeks, while he recovered from the illness. He spent the time lying in bed and just praying for it to be all over with. Finally, his fever broke and the family were overjoyed. When George and his brother Albert Victor were separated, it did not take long for Albert Victor to spiral downwards. Albert Victor was gaining a reputation that no one in England wanted at the time. There were rumours spiralling of all varieties, including scandalous affairs with chorus girls, as well as controversial antics at a gay brothel. Albert Victor would become engaged to Mary of Teck, but due to tragedy, the pair would never go on to marry. Instead, there was a twist on the horizon. The pair were blissfully engaged for 6 wonderful weeks before the influenza pandemic hit and ravaged the royal court. The disease took over the body of Prince Albert Victor, who later died at the tragically young age of 28 on the 14th of January 1892. Albert was George's lifelong friend as well as his brother, and he had been tragically taken too soon. Not only had he died, but so had his prospects as future king. This meant that the role fell into the hands of George, and George was unprepared for this role and did not expect to take over the crown at all. Queen Victoria had spent a long time finding a bride suitable for a future reigning monarch, with Princess Mary of Teck, and she was not about to let this bride out of her grips. Queen Victoria therefore wished for Mary of Teck to marry George instead, and this was a strange twist of events, as she was previously married to his dead brother. Surprisingly, this match worked out very well for the pair. George and Mary must have struggled at first with the notion of marrying each other, when the pair envisioned completely different roles in their relationship. However, over the coming months the pair would grow to like one another, and they shared a deep grief for Albert Victor. 1 year after losing Albert, George asked Mary's hand, and she said yes. George and Mary of Teck had a dedicated and loving relationship. Their relationship in private was an affectionate one, but in public they appeared cold and distant due to George struggling with public affection. Their love was evident in the loving letters that they sent each other over the years, and pretty soon they would both need all the help that they could get. George and Mary would go on to have a large family together, producing many heirs to the throne. They had 6 children, 5 of which were sons, and 1 was a daughter. George allegedly gave a simple explanation of his fatherhood style. My father was frightened as his mother, and I was frightened of my father, and I am darn well going to see it that my children are frightened of me. That would certainly line up with what his son Henry would later say about him, calling George a terrible father. Maybe the kids resented the fact that George didn't give them the life that most royal families expected. George was entitled to live in the most lavish of palaces and castles in the UK, but instead he opted for a more humble small family home at York Cottage, a relatively small house in Norfolk. Despite being the next in line for the throne as the King of the UK, his appearance on the outside would make you believe that he was just an upper middle class family rather than the next king. Perhaps he loved this home so much because it allowed him to take part in his hobbies in the countryside. Queen Victoria was still alive, and so the crown was still very far away from George at this point. He was another man with a future reign, with a lot of time on his hands, and like Edward, he had some controversial hobbies. He was into shooting, and shooting animals too. He had plenty of time to kill, and he took that literally. As his official biographer put it, when he was the Duke of York, he did nothing at all but kill animals and stick in stamps. George's 2 great loves were hunting and stamp collecting, though one of those pastimes got a little bloodier than the other. When George became the Emperor of India, George and his wife took a trip through the Indian subcontinent, giving him access to many big game kills. During his 10-day trip, he shot 21 tigers, 8 rhinos, and a bear. He may have been rich, but you did not want to mess with George while he had a gun in his hand. George was becoming obsessed with his bloody hobby of killing animals, and one day he perhaps took it too far when he went hunting for a 6-hour stint on the 18th of December 1913. In that time, he shot 1,000 pheasants. That's 1 bird every 20 seconds, and once he was finished, even George admitted that perhaps he had gone overboard. "We went a little too far," he remarked. Join me in part 3 to delve into his life as king, as well as his German enemies, his involvement in World War I, and his betrayal of his family, which ended in their untimely, tragic assassination. When Queen Victoria passed away, his father was catapulted into power. The long-awaited role of king was his, and when he became King Edward VII, this made George the new Prince of Wales, and he would learn as much as he could over the years on how to become king from his father. The rest of his time was spent making and raising a family, as well as travelling the world. It is a good job that he was able to be educated on his future role as king, as his father was not on the throne for long. And his father's controversial habits had finally caught up on him. The years of eating, drinking, and sleeping were no more. Queen Victoria reigned over Britain for 63 years, but his father would only be king for a fraction of the time, with 9 years. He succumbed to illness on the 6th of May 1910, and George was devastated. He wrote, "I have lost my best friend, and the best of fathers. I am heartbroken and overwhelmed with grief." The death of his father did not take front and centre of his mind for long, as he had other things to worry about with the ongoings of World War I. On the 4th of August 1914, 4 years after George became king, he wrote a frank entry in his diary. "I held a council at 10:45 to declare war with Germany. It is a terrible catastrophe, but it is not our fault. Please to God it may be soon over." World War I was the most horrifying conflict the world had ever seen, and the politics of it were very close to home, with his own family members serving as enemies. Kaiser Wilhelm II was the figurehead of Germany at the time, and George and Britain blamed him wholeheartedly for the destruction on the world. Wilhelm was in fact George's first cousin. This was a war of families as well as continents. Strangely enough, George's ancestry was German. He came from the house of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha. It was difficult, therefore, for him to portray himself with proud national British status. Britons watched as thousands upon thousands of their fathers, sons and brothers went off to fight Germans, while a German ruled them. It did not go unnoticed by the public, and George knew that he had to do something drastic to change the narrative. He changed his family name from the House of Saxe-Coburg in Gotha to the House of Windsor by official royal proclamation. He convinced his other German relatives to take up the name too, with Prince Louis of Battenberg changing his name to Louis Mountbatten. The name lives on today, with the current monarchy serving under the House of Windsor, but George could not reform all ills with this statement. During a stressful period for George, his other first cousin was coming into trouble in Russia, when Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown by a dangerous and murderous family, the Bolsheviks, who had taken over the country. The government were quick to offer their support and help in the form of asylum for the family, but oddly, George heartlessly turned them away, with devastating and fatal consequences. This was the ultimate betrayal to his own family. Rather than fuel a revolution in his own country, which is what George believed the Romanov family would do, he tragically turned them away. His cousin and his family were left alone to be murdered in cold blood, after several grueling months in captivity. Their bodies were dumped down an abandoned mineshaft. In 1918, the war ended, and King George, alongside his people, rejoiced with happiness for the first time in a long time. However, there would be tragedy on the horizon for George. Prince John, George's youngest child, was born in 1905, but from the moment of his birth, he was a sickly and frail boy. Little Johnny was the baby of the family, but no matter how much anyone spoiled him, his health just never improved. Finally, just 2 months after Armistice, George's worst fear came true when he suffered a seizure on the 18th of January 1919 that he would never recover from. Tragically, at only the young age of 13, he passed away in his sleep. George and his wife, Mary, were both devastated, but part of them was relieved. John's entire life had been filled with sickness and pain, and in a letter George painfully described John's passing as the greatest mercy possible. It was George that started the Christmas tradition that we so eagerly await today from the current monarchy. In 1932, he sat down to address the nation for the first ever radio announcement from the monarchy on Christmas Day. This was not something he was overly enthralled to do, but his advisors reminded him that his people wanted to hear from him. And off the back of his announcement, the people felt connected to him, and he won the hearts of the nation, making him a beloved king, even if he didn't see it. In 1935, George celebrated his Silver Jubilee. Thousands of people joined the streets to celebrate the occasions with him. His radio address had allowed him to reach his people, unlike any monarch who became before him. When he heard the Crown's adulation, he exclaimed, "I cannot understand it. After all, I am only a very ordinary sort of fellow." George was part of a large brood of siblings, and his older brother was the problem child, and this pattern repeated itself in his own children. George's relationship with his eldest son Edward grew more and more strained as the years went on, despite being close when he was younger. Now, oftentimes, fathers expect too much of their sons, but in this case, George was 100% right. Prince Edward was not the kind of guy to make a father proud. Join me in part 4 to delve into how his son took his adulterous and promiscuous behaviour of his father, as well as being involved in the scandals of all royal scandals. I will also look at how King George, his own doctor, euthanized him. George's son, Edward VIII, had a lot in common with his controversial grandfather rather than his upstanding father. He embarked on many affairs with married women, courtesans, and whoever else happened to catch his eye. Edward's antics disappointed George and the other royals, but they were glad that his drama was out of the public eye. However, this would not remain the case forever, and eventually he got himself involved with a scandalous woman who murdered her husband and threatened to bring down the monarchy. Edward VIII became entangled with Marguerite Alibert, and she was not the kind of person that George wanted his son sleeping around with. Marguerite Alibert was a French high-class prostitute who became the first lover of Edward, the Prince of Wales and heir to the British throne. She would later be at the centre of the biggest scandal of the times, and she was very nearly damaged the reputation of the future king and the monarchy. A series of events began to stop the scandal from getting out of control, and that is the interesting story of Marguerite Alibert, the prostitute turned princess turned murderer. Edward VIII is famously known for giving up the throne in 1937 in order to be with the love of his life, Wallis Simpson, who he was not permitted to be with because she was a divorcee twice before. This scandal was prevalent throughout Europe, but 20 years before, another scandal was taking shape. The affair was kept under wraps by the prince, and he only declared his feelings for his mistress on paper, but she kept them all. George used all of his power to ensure that his son's name never appeared in the press surrounding Marguerite Alibert. And although he almost succeeded, with just the odd rumours whirling, the public never learned that the Prince of Wales had an affair with a working girl who then shot her new lover. George eventually tracked down every last letter that Edward had written to Alibert and had them destroyed. But the damage was done, and George would never truly trust his son again. His eldest son caused him a lot of stress, but he did have another son who he adored and respected. This man would go on to become the future king when his scandalous brother put his love with a divorced woman above his duty to the throne. He was also very fond of his granddaughter, Lilibet, known by the public as Queen Elizabeth II. She loved him in turn, affectionately calling him Grandpa England. He thought both of them would make excellent monarchs, if only they got the chance. Maybe George had a sixth sense for what would transpire, or maybe his disappointment in his son had created a self-fulfilling prophecy, but by 1935, George's faith in his son and heir had all but evaporated. He is reported to have said, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself within 12 months. I pray to God my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet and the throne." George had always been the epitome of health, especially as a young, strapping lad as a sailor. But the years as king took his toll on him, and he had been involved in a few accidents that caused him poor health. The once hale and hearty king grew frail and sickly, and a painful tragedy only made things worse when he lost his favourite sister. During World War I, his horse buckled and threw him to the ground, causing serious injury from which he never fully recovered, alongside smoking many a cigarette throughout his entire life, and those took a toll on his health. George had been extremely close to his eldest and late brother Edward VII, but he had also another sibling of which he adored, and she was his little sister Victoria. In December of 1935, when George was at death's door, Victoria suffered a hemorrhage and suddenly passed away. Her loss sent the king into a spiralling depression from which he would never recover. By January 1936, only a month after the death of his sister, George was still clinging on to life, but only just. He was now staying at the country estate of Sandringham House, and he was getting more and more frail, which restricted him to just his bedroom. Finally, his doctors released a statement. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close, and that it did. George passed quietly in his sleep on the 20th of January 1936, or so it seemed, but there was more to the story that was shocking. Lord Dawson of Penn was George's chief physician in his final days. He kept a diary from his time with the king, and it made for an interesting read. He kept them a closely guarded secret for the rest of his life. In 1986, his diaries were made public, and they revealed the king's last words, a mumbled, "God damn you," to his nurse. This was not the only thing his diaries talked about. Lord Dawson, a highly regarded doctor, had lied about that fateful night, as it would actually appear that his own doctor euthanized him. The entire world thought that George had passed from natural causes because that is what they were told, and no one would have questioned that something much more shocking had happened. However, Dawson was an avid believer in euthanasia, and so he took it upon himself to end the king's life, in a bid to give him a kinder, less slow and painful end. Dawson knew that George's end might take hours or even days, and he saw the toll that it was taking on the king's family. So he made the decision to kill the king. He injected him with morphine and cocaine. 15 minutes later, George's breath slowed, then stopped. Upon his passing, George's son Edward became King Edward VIII, but not only did George not see a leader or a king in his son also didn't fancy it either. George thought he'd make a terrible king, but apparently so did Edward. Before the year was out, Edward abdicated his throne so that he could marry his divorcee partner, Wallis Simpson. He was then free to live a life of high fashion, German sympathies, and extreme prejudice, while his younger brother became King George VI. So King George got what he wanted in the end, when his second son and then granddaughter would reign over Britain. Please continue to support my channel by subscribing. Let's delve deeper into the life and legacy of Prince Alexander John of Wales, a child born into privilege but marked by the cruel hand of fate. Prince Alexander John of Wales, the sixth child and youngest son of Prince Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, and Princess Alexandra, Princess of Wales, came into the world on a crisp April day in 1871. His birthplace was none other than the splendid Sandringham House, a residence synonymous with British royal grandeur. Regrettably, Alexander John's entrance into this world was marred by adversity from the very beginning. Born prematurely, his fragile constitution rendered him a sickly infant, and heartbreakingly, he would spend only 24 fleeting hours in the embrace of life. Despite the nature of his existence, he was christened with a name that bore echoes of majesty and heritage, Alexander John Charles Albert. However, within the intimate circles of his family, he was affectionately known as John, a name that would come to symbolize both his brief presence and the tender affection bestowed upon him during his tragically short life. When the inevitable came to pass and young John's fragile flame was extinguished, his final resting place became a poignant reminder of the fleeting nature of existence. He was laid to rest below the venerable walls of Sandringham Church, known as the Church of St. Mary's Magdalene, located amidst the serene and picturesque landscapes of Norfolk. Here, in the tranquil shadows of this sacred edifice, his memory would endure. Yet the tragic destiny of the name John did not end with Prince Alexander John. In the annals of the British royal family, this name had acquired an aura of ill omen. This superstition was tragically reinforced when Prince John, the youngest son of King George V, was interred beside his ill-fated uncle, Prince Alexander John of Wales, within the consecrated grounds of Sandringham. The bonds of family, it seemed, could not escape the dark spectre of fate. History repeated itself once more when John Spencer, the brother of the beloved Princess Diana, was born into the world on a bitter winter's day, the 12th of January 1960. Tragically, like his ill-fated predecessors, he too faced an untimely and sorrowful demise, a mere 10 hours after his birth. In a poignant symmetry with the past, John Spencer too found his eternal rest among the solemn and sacred precedents of Sandringham, forging yet another link to the chain of melancholy that bound these souls across generations. Thus the tale of Prince Alexander John of Wales serves as a poignant reminder of the roles of fate, the weight of a name, and the enduring bonds that tie generations of a royal family, not just in life, but in the shared sorrow of untimely departures and unfulfilled destinies.